Welcome to the Cloisters at Hereford Cathedral. As part of our Eastern Cloisters project, which has been generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, we are able to open up this special place to visitors far more than we used to be able to. This place was home to our Vicar's Choral for over 400 years, and today it's home to our Dean, our Vergers and our Director of Music, meaning that it has been home to our cathedral community for over 5 centuries, and it's a really special place, so I'm very excited to show you around today. So the very first reference to our Vicar's Choral here at Hereford Cathedral was with cake. The first reference that we have to them is at the end of the 12th century, when a local benefactor gave money for every vicar in the area to buy simnel cake for themselves for Easter. And this is the very first time that we see reference to our Vicar's Choral. They were called Vicar Choral because it came from the word vicar, meaning deputy, and choral, meaning choir, obviously. And the idea was that they sang in place of other clergy who were too busy off in the area doing other jobs, and they weren't here to sing services. It got a bit embarrassing for the cathedral because a visitor came one day and said that Mass was so meagrely celebrated that it sounded no better than in a parish church because there were so few men singing here. So the cathedral started to employ these men, these Vicar's Choral, and each time that the benefactor gave money to the cathedral, they spent that money on employing more. So gradually, from the 12th century through to the 15th, we built up to 27 men. Lots of other cathedrals had Vicar's Choral for the same reason, to make up for the missing clergy, but unlike other cathedrals, ours were employed as a group. So in other cathedrals, they'd be employed as a deputy to a specific vicar. Here, they were a group en masse, a little community, right from the outset. And I think that's really lovely that they were that special little community. But as time went on, they started to get a bit frustrated that they wanted to own lands as a group and have income as a group on top of their cathedral pay. And they got into an argument about it with Dean and Chapter. And the way that they fixed this argument, which I think is awfully impressive, they went to the King. And they got themselves incorporated as a college in 1395 by Richard II, which I think is a great way to solve an argument. You're a bit stumped, get the King to fix it. By this point, they were a college, they were incorporated, it gave them their own seal, they had their own custos, so a person in charge of them, and they also had their own house on Castle Street that had been given to them by another vicar. Now, you might think that was quite a cushy life, and it was really, but it didn't stop them misbehaving. And as time went on, more and more rules had to be brought in to make sure that they behaved themselves. Things like no jangling in the choir, no puerile talk. In fact, they weren't even meant to smile when they came into the choir. I don't think that's very friendly. They had to make sure that they knew all of the psalms, all the hymnary within a year and a day of starting as a Vicar Choral. I'm not really sure what the extra day achieved, because I think if you haven't learned them within a year, a day is probably too late to learn the rest. But they had a lot of responsibilities as a group, and that meant that they did consider themselves to be pretty important. In fact, they considered themselves to be so important that they got a bit sick of having to walk from their old house on Castle Street to here at the cathedral several times a day. And they complained to the bishop that due to the weather and the fear of evildoers, it wasn't safe for them to try and walk here every day. So they petitioned Bishop Stanbury to build them their own new home. Now, you might think that's a really reasonable request, until you find out that their house on Castle Street is only 150 metres away. It's not all that far to have to walk, even at midnight. But that's our Vicar's Choral for you. They were a fairly defiant group. The result of their petitioning to Bishop Stanbury was the beautiful cloisters that we're about to go and have a look at. But one of their other achievements is this walkway that we're in now. Even after their cloisters were built, they still didn't like that they had to walk from their house to the cathedral and that they would get wet, which is a whole 100 metres. It's not that far. But they complained, and the next bishop built them this beautiful walkway here. And I often say that the vicars must have been fairly wimpy to not be willing to get wet to walk from their house to the cathedral, until another colleague here pointed out to me that we all really appreciate being able to stay dry even today when we have to walk from our office to the cathedral. So maybe I am quite grateful for this walkway. So we'll go and have a look now and look at their house, the Cloisters. These are our beautiful cloisters, and they were commissioned in 1472 and finished by 1475, which seems awfully speedy to build a whole cloister. As you can see, it's in a quadrant shape, but not quite a perfect square. These cloisters were built on the remains of 2 old canonical houses, so houses that had belonged to canons, and one of them we know was completely flat, but the other one had still been having people live in it just a few years before, so we think the weird shape is because they were avoiding some of the ruins. The shape here, with the 4, had individual dwellings off each range, so you can see lots of doorways along the wall, and there were 27 dwellings, 1 for each man. There was also a communal library and a dining hall and a chapel. The idea was that they were supposed to be living here in a community. It was a bit like university halls, and a lot like university halls. All of the rooms were identical when they arrived, but each one of the men decorated them according to their taste and their wealth, because it would have been very expensive to have someone decorate and paint, literally paint your wall paintings in your room. Amazingly, some of the original 15th century wall paintings still remain today and have been preserved as part of the project. Each room looked completely different and represented the men that lived there. Also like university halls, the vicars got up to quite a lot of mischief here in the cloisters. It wasn't the kind of quiet, contemplative environment that you might imagine it would be, or that I assume Dean and Chapter hoped it would be. Instead of spending their time studying, most of them spent their time getting into mischief. We're fortunate here to have act books that record the incidences with the Vicar's Choral as early as the 16th century, so we know exactly what they were all getting up to, and many of them were being told off and having their pay suspended for misbehaving quite seriously. One of them threw a key at one of the servants, but if you think how big a key was in those days, it wasn't like a little key fob, it was quite a large weapon. Another one threw a knife at someone else during dinner time and uttered intemperate words. One of them even drew blood from one of the others. That's how serious the fighting got. There were also several that were told off for embezzling and stealing money. But in one of my favourite incidences, George Allen not only embezzled the money, but then tried to cover it up. He wouldn't let anyone get into the house with all the records in it. So the other members of the Vicar's Choral had to break into that room. They then charged Allen for the cost of changing the locks. Allen didn't ever pay up. He also got told off for having a woman in his chamber on 3 separate occasions. Somehow, Allen was still appointed to the position of librarian, along with lots of his other Vicar's Choral colleagues who weren't the best behaved men here, which suggests that they didn't take the role of librarian or the care of their library all that seriously. In fact, in 1588 we have a letter from the Vicar's Choral to the Dean and Chapter asking to swap all their old Latin books for new English ones because they can't be bothered to read the old Latin ones. It gives us the impression that the Vicar's Choral weren't a very scholarly lot. They were more interested in having fun, I think, than learning anything. But in 1582 there was a real shift here at the cloisters because a royal commission said that instead of the 27 men that they had, they were only allowed 12. That meant that the numbers gradually dwindled through the years. So as one left or died, they usually died rather than leaving here. It was a cushy job, people didn't want to go. They didn't replace them until they were down to 12. Well, not quite 12. The records show that there was often a 13th man as a spare. Not quite sure how they managed that. But with only 12 of them, or 13, meant that there were lots of rooms spare here in the cloisters. And so what they started to do was knock through into their neighbours' houses, sometimes with permission, sometimes not. And the act books show people knocking through and then billing Dean and Chapter for the work. Not quite sure that's how you go about it today. Less men still mean better behaved men, and the act books are still full of stories. And Dean and Chapter get so frustrated that they introduce a curfew in 1609 to stop the men going out into town late at night. I assume that means that they would drink less. It didn't seem to work, because in the account books from later on that year, we have lots of records of the Dean and Chapter having to repair the gates. Either the men were breaking out after curfew or breaking back in after coming home too late. But eventually, just a few years later, the cloisters closed for good and the big door was shut, because as the Civil War arrived, the men had to leave. The Vicar's Choral here were no longer able to serve in the church because the Church of England had been dissolved. So the men went elsewhere. Some of them had to rely on charity, some of them moved to country parishes, and some stayed with family. We think that a couple may have stayed in the area, but none of them stayed here. Instead, the cloisters were sold off to Colonel Birch, who we think used them to house the homeless people of the city. But either way, the Vicar's Choral had to leave their beautiful cloisters for 15 years. When the men returned in 1660, the cloisters were in a state of disrepair. No one had been looking after them during the Civil War, and things were in quite a state. But the men themselves were in a state too. Of the 12 that had left before the Civil War, only half returned because they died in the interim. So those who had remembered the time before the war were actually in the minority, and they were overridden by these new men that were coming in. They were a really mixed bunch, this new lot. Humphrey Fisher was employed as the archivist, and he was also in charge of looking after a lot of the repair work. He was really diligent. He made copies of all the early Act books. He paid for some of the work himself on the cloister because he was worried it wouldn't get done, and then claimed the repayment from the rest of the college. And he worked really hard to make sure that they were looked after. There were other men who were a bit more distracted by other things. So a lot of the men spent their time instead working on the music of the city and trying to bring more music into the surrounding area. They used to go and take the choir out into concerts in the coffee houses and the pubs and the taverns around the city, rather than just being here in the cathedral. William Felton was really key to that. William Felton also was instrumental in extending our college hall so that it could be used for concerts, and he made sure that that was done in time for the festival of 1753, which is what we now know as the Three Choirs Festival. One of his other colleagues, Henry Hall, spent his time singing out in taverns as well, but he had quite a reputation as an eccentric, and as well as singing, he would write lots of satirical poems about the other vicars and about life in Hereford. There were also men of that time that struggled with their time in the cloisters and really struggled with their mental health. One of the vicars, Henry Taswell, developed some issues, and he started to become quite unpredictable in his behaviour. He grew his nails and his hair long, he used to play drums in the middle of the night, and he used to be found making all sorts of noises and singing. But the vicars still welcomed him here and looked after him in the cloister. One of their other vicars, William Crowther, he also struggled with mental health, and instead of keeping them here, they understood that they couldn't look after him. His needs were more severe, and they moved him to an asylum nearby, which was actually quite new for the time, and they made sure that he was really well looked after. There was also Richard Waring. He, by modern standards, we would probably say suffered with depression, but then they described him as having a moroseness of disposition, and his portrait definitely reflects that. And no one was particularly keen on poor Richard. Even today, his portrait isn't all that flattering. But there were also men that were just like the Vicar's Choral of old, who were getting into mischief, just as they'd always done. And one of our favourite stories here at the Cathedral of a Vicar's Choral is John Broad, who one evening was sitting in the dining hall having dinner with his fellow vicars when a woman came in with a babe in arms, put it at his feet and said, "Here is your child, look to it." Essentially, here's your baby, John, you look after it, you do something to help. A few years later, he's recorded as living with that woman in the census records, so we hope that he did look after her. The people here were generally good at looking after each other and each other's families, so not only did they make sure Crowther was well looked after, but they made sure that people living here were looked after really well as well. They also had commoners living with them because they still had lots of spare rooms, and the longest running tenant was Dr. William Cam, who was here for 37 years in total. When he finally decided he wanted to move out of the cloister into a house on Castle Street, he talked to the butler, John Constable, about what an appropriate leaving gift would be. He was quite keen to buy some expensive port for the vicars, which I'm sure they would have greatly appreciated. But instead, sensible John convinced Cam that actually what he really wanted to do was pay for new paving stones in the cloister. I mean, it probably lasted longer, but it doesn't seem as fun as a leaving gift. Poor John actually didn't survive much longer after Cam left because of a series of fires that took place here in the cloister. There were a series of arson attempts in the 1820s, and they burnt down small bits of rooms and dwellings, but nothing too serious. They arrested one of the choristers, but he was never formally charged, so I don't think they ever quite worked out who was responsible. But then in 1828 there was a particularly serious fire, and it knocked out a whole corner of the cloister. Poor John heard that there was a fire and ran back into the cloisters to save all the silver plate that belonged to the college. He did get in, but the stairs collapsed, and unfortunately he was trapped upstairs and became overwhelmed by smoke, and he died 3 days later in the infirmary. He had a wife and a daughter, and the Vicar's Choral made sure that they were well looked after for years to come and made sure that they had somewhere to live. So they were a lovely community bunch. But The 19th century was a time of real change here in the cloisters, and for better and for worse. After the fires in the 1820s, they had to repair a large chunk of the cloister. The whole eastern range corner had to be rebuilt so that it could be repaired. But Henry Pierce, one of the vicars, chose this time to try and move his wife into the cloisters with him. Now, although vicars could marry post-Reformation, many of them did, but they moved out and they didn't bring their wives into the cloister. Only one man had tried before and failed. His request was rejected. But Henry Pierce tried in 1832 to move his wife Mary in with him. Strangely, he'd been married to Mary by 11 years at this point, so I'm not really sure where she was in those intervening 11 years. Anyway, he put in his request to move Mary in, and the rest of the college were in uproar. They hated the idea of having women living in the cloisters with them. Somehow his request was approved, but no one was happy about it, and poor Henry and Mary lived here for several years, but Henry was then deliberately passed over for every promotion that came up. It even says in the Act books that the position should be offered to everyone except Pierce. Mary died before Henry, and when Henry died, there's a notice in the local paper selling off all the belongings in his room because he had no one else. It was a bit of a sad end for Henry. What follows next in the story of the College of Vicars Choral could either be seen as a very sad chapter in their existence or an exciting new one, depending on your perspective, and I suspect that many people at the time differed in their opinion as well. In 1851, a new rule came in which said that colleges like this could only have 6 members, meaning that there could only be 6 paid men singing in the choir. Now, that clearly wasn't enough men to make the choir sound right, so cathedrals across the country started to employ men that they called lay clerks. They were very different people. They didn't live here in the cloister, they weren't entitled to the same incomes as the rest of the Vicars Choral, and it wasn't quite that same community feel. Many of them had other jobs. Amusingly, some of them got into trouble for losing money and going bankrupt, while one of them was running his own money lending business on the side of being a lay clerk. They were a very mixed bunch, and they were far more like the professional singers that we have today. They weren't interested necessarily in being part of the community here. We still had 6 Vicars Choral for the rest of the 19th century who worked alongside these lay clerks, and they were an interesting group, but it was still a very different time. They weren't that large community of 27, there were just 6 of them. Many of them came here as young men. This was considered quite a good place to start your singing career. While the Vicars Choral of old would often come here as the peak of their career and only leave when they died, the men came here in the 19th century to gain a reputation, to make links and then move on to other positions in other cathedrals or colleges at Oxford or Cambridge. A lot of the vicars came here straight from university. Men like Alfred Robinson moved here and did the whole of their transition through curacies and ordination here. Alfred is a particularly sad story because in 1882 he killed himself in the River Wye. Only 6 weeks later, one of his fellow Vicars Choral, Francis Izard, died of natural causes while visiting family in Ireland. Just a couple of weeks later, one of the remaining Vicars Choral, Charles Wiggs Fredericks, asked for a leave of absence. We initially thought that was for compassionate leave, which would seem legitimate considering what had happened, but in fact it was just an opportunity for him to practice his singing, and he moved to Lichfield Cathedral not long after. Alongside men like Alfred and Francis in the dark times that followed, there were men who were more interested in mischief. One of the worst offenders of the 19th century was Robert Andrews, and he is a mystery that remains to this day. In December 1885, Robert Andrews presented a telegram to the Dean and said that his friend needed him to go and sing at a concert in Birmingham, so could he have a few services off? And the Dean agreed. Quite surprising considering that Christmas was only a week away, but the Dean must have thought it was a legitimate reason. So Robert Andrews went off to Birmingham, and he wrote his wife Annie a letter the following day that said, I will be away for a few days. I'll be back by Monday or Wednesday at the latest. There's some money in the money box. Help yourself to some of it, but not too much, and give the children a kiss from me." And that was the last that anyone ever heard of Robert Andrews. Shortly after he disappeared, one of his other sons died, which was incredibly sad for poor Annie, and things got even worse when they discovered that Robert had actually stolen around £600 from parish funds. That equates to a lot of money in today's money, and he'd managed to steal that over the course of a year. He had envisaged this kind of very clever system where he had 2 sets of books, and he could give the fake one to anyone auditing and keep the real one with all the actual numbers of what he'd stolen for himself. We set a challenge to our research volunteers and our community to try and find Robert, and no one could find him. But we have managed to find Annie, and we know that she survived into her 80s in Manchester, and we hope that she lived a nice life after her time here. Not quite as bad, but equally mischievous, was William Russ Innes, who took Dean and Chapter to court in the 1890s because he was told off for not doing his job properly. Dean and Chapter said that he should be singing all the services, and he refused. And when it came to court, his excuse was the best one I've ever heard. He said that as he had been ordained in the Church of Scotland, the Church of England couldn't tell him what to do anyway, and the case was thrown out. He didn't really ever return after that. It was a real time of transition as these kind of new professional singers and lay clerks started to take over from the Vicar's Choral of old. Gradually the Vicar's Choral went down to 4 and then just 2, and eventually a Royal Commission said that colleges like the College of Vicars Choral should be dissolved. So in 1937 those last 2 Vicar Choral gathered here at the cathedral to meet for the very last time, and that was the end of the College of Vicars Choral. In fact, the minutes for that meeting were never signed, which seems quite a sad end to a very strong start as a college being incorporated by the King. Although those stories from the 19th century make it sound like it was a very sad time, it was also quite an exciting time here in the cloisters. Alongside the lay clerks and Vicars Choral who were getting into trouble, there were also some very interesting families moving in who were interested in fighting for reform and justice, and they were families. After centuries of it just being men, all of a sudden women and children were starting to move in. The Duncan family moved in. Reverend William Duncan Vanderhorst Duncan, yes, Duncan really is in there twice, and his wife Isabella moved in with his children. They lived next door at number 14, and they were a really interesting family because Reverend Duncan was part of a meeting as early as 1878 to talk about the fight for women's suffrage. Just a few doors down, Reverend George Davis lived with his wife Ethel, and they were also both really involved with the suffrage movement here in Hereford and across the country. Reverend Davis used to travel the rest of the country giving lectures and talks and sermons about allowing women the right to vote. He was a suffragist, you would say now. He was much calmer in his approach with these lectures and talks, while George was taking a softer approach to the fight for women's suffrage. His wife Ethel was more vocal. She was out on the streets of Hereford selling the Votes for Women magazine and being involved in lots of meetings. She also on one occasion stormed Hereford courts because a young woman was being tried for the murder of her child, and Ethel stormed the courts and said that she objected as a wife and a mother and that no woman should be treated like this. They were a really interesting group of people living here at the end of the 19th century and start of the 20th century. We're really fortunate that as part of the Eastern Cloisters project, we've been doing oral history interviews with residents of the cloisters. Obviously they don't go quite as far back as the 1920s, but they tell us what the cloisters have been like from the 1960s onwards. And they give us stories of Christmas parties here in the old chapel, and gathering for 3 Choirs festivals out on the lawn, and joining together as a community of lay clerks who were newly married or vergers moving in with their family. A whole mix of people all coming together to support each other here. The cloisters are just the same today. Our dean lives here, as does our vergers and our director of music and their family. And it is a mix of people that live and work here on a daily basis. And it is still very much a home and very much a community. The room that we're standing in now is the old chapel, which has been renovated as part of the Eastern Cloisters project. And this was the chapel for the Vicar's Choral and their library. But now it's going to be home to lots of new community activities that continue on the spirit of the cloister. We're really excited that through this Eastern Cloisters project and the renovation of Old Chapel and our work to make the cloisters more accessible, we can share this wonderful place with lots of visitors for years to come.